Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian Literature for the Inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, a PhD student in Russian Lit.
And I'm Cameron Lalana.
This is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. This week we're joined by Dr. Ian Garner, who's going to be helping us make sense of Pavel Nilin's short story, The Polykhaevs, as we slowly continue morphing into just a socialist realism podcast. Dr. Garner is a historian, editor, and translator who completed his PhD at the University of Toronto in 2017 after studying at the University of Bristol and St. Petersburg State Conservatory. His academic work focuses on Soviet and Russian literary and cultural representations of World War II, and he is on a mission to illuminate the hidden sides of Soviet life, a world of thoughts and feelings hidden behind closed doors and the Iron Curtain, through engaging wider Western audiences in recent academic discoveries. His work on Stalingrad and Russian culture has been featured in numerous publications and showcased in talks at universities, museums, and conferences in North America, Europe, and Russia. Ian, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for that stellar introduction. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about this really obscure piece of socialist realist fiction that I think are probably some of the first people ever to have read this in English, because I translated it into English myself. It's an offcut from my forthcoming book, Stalingrad Lives. I couldn't quite cram it in there. The book is already too long, and I'm battling with it. But it's a really cool little story. It's got some interesting stuff going on, so it'll be fun to discuss it and to bring Pavel Nilin, the author, to Western readers a little bit, because I don't think there's anything of his that actually exists in any English translation whatsoever. It barely exists in Russian anymore.
That's great. We always say that's what we want to cover on the podcast. We're only doing the big names so that people will stick around when we decide to cover the smaller texts. That's what we're here for, mostly.
Well, this is the smallest text. It's not just obscure. It's also really short, right? It's like 7,000 words long, so anyone can get through this.
One. Yeah, and we'll be it's available on Ian's website, so I'll be linking that in the show notes if you yourself want to take a look at it. It's a really fun read in addition to being pretty quick. Before we get into today's episode, we wanted to remind everyone that our Crime and Punishment series is going to be kicking off next episode. Grab a copy of the book through our affiliate links on our website and consider becoming a Patreon to join our monthly reading group. For as little as $3 a month, you can get access to early episodes, join our reading group, and have a say in what we read next. If you're not interested in Patreon but still want to help us out, you can leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts or sign up for our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
Great updates, Cameron.
Thank you. But before we get into the reading today, Matt, Ian, I've got a question for you. What are you two drinking today?
Well, I am actually just waiting for a COVID test result to come back, so normally I would love at 8 o'clock on a Monday evening to get cracking on a nice glass of wine, but I feel that's a very, very bad idea. We're going to edit out all my coughs and harumphs, but I just have a nice, comforting cup of coffee.
That's a good call.
Well, I will cheers to a hopefully negative COVID test with my concoction that I've made with things around my house. This is yes, a glass of ice first, then Trader Joe's gingerbread liqueur second, and then a splash of bourbon third, and then I stir it together, and that's how I record. So. What about you, Cameron?
Not sober. I am drinking. So I've got a beer with a little bit of a story. So a friend of mine recently had a Polish Heritage Day at her work, and that included one of our actually Polish coworkers coming up with a bunch of Polish tongue twisters, which are, to be clear, tongue twisters in Polish that are difficult for him to say. And then made it a competition out of it, which she won. Which she does not speak any Polish, but for winning that, she won PRL. Schmelinie beer, don't know how to pronounce that, which translated by Yandex has helpfully told me that this is translates to hoppy beer. So I'm drinking a Polish pale ale, I think. I honestly don't know any of these things on here say. Can't say that this is legally imported to the U.S., but I'm excited to try it.
Dubious imports aside.
That's what we're all about here. So yeah, that aside, let's get into the Polykhaevs. Before we talk about the story proper, Ian, so like you mentioned, this is from an author, Pavel Nilin, not a name that probably a lot of people listening to this have heard before. Could you talk to us briefly about Mr. Nilin?
Oh boy, can I?
Nihil.
Nobody's ever asked me to do this before. I'm so excited. So this guy, I mean, he's not a great author, right? Nobody who's going to read this story is going to think, whoa, this is the undiscovered Tolstoy, the Dostoevsky of the 20th century that we were missing. But I think he's interesting as a socialist realist author because of his very ordinary background and because of the way he went about producing his stories. He's almost so average as to be exceptional. So this guy is born in Irkutsk, 1908, to really very humble origins, a peasant family. He has a brother, and interestingly, you can tell how peasanty they are because he and the brother correspond, and I've read the correspondence in the archives. And they write to each other in these like terribly ungrammatical Russian, and especially the brother is barely literate, even well into the 40s. And he gets to be some like supremo manager on a dairy farm somewhere close to Irkutsk. So, you know, in Soviet terms, he's really made it. But Nilin spends the 1920s, he clearly gets on board with the Bolsheviks pretty quick. And I mean, you know, he's only a child when the revolution happens, but he's a policeman in the 1920s. Can't tell you what he was up to, can't tell you how sketchy and immoral anything that he might have been doing in the 20s was. But by the mid-30s, he has become an author. He starts publishing some short stories, and he really makes a name for himself as a writer of children's stories and sort of young adult fiction during the war. And I would say the Polykhaevs, the story we're looking at, is really a young adult work. This is not designed for people in their 30s, 40s, and whatever else. And during the war, he really makes such a name that he's able to use this, as many authors do during the wartime, to a greater career after the war. So to the point that by the late 40s, I know that other writers are writing to him for advice on, you know, dear Mr. Nilin, how can I improve my story? How can I get this published? Alexander Twardowski, who becomes the editor of Novy Mir, the big literary journal, holds him up in 1950 as a great example of a writer. And he produces really a couple of major works. In the late 30s, he has this work, A Big Life, and there is a film version of it. And this is the most like prototypical socialist realist work you can possibly imagine. It's about some miners in Ukraine, and they really, really want to beat a production record. But there's a wrecker on the mine, and so they go down into the mine, and they have to like face down the wrecker, and they emerge from the mine as heroes, and the book is, I'm going to be honest, boring and overly long, and the film is equally boring and equally overlong. I'm really not selling this guy. Then he has a bit of a hiccup in the early 50s. I haven't quite managed to ever work out what the hiccup is. There's virtually no written sources on Nilin. And I've actually been in contact with his children and grandchildren, and they don't know what happened either. But there is some awkwardness in the early 50s. However, that seems to miraculously go away, I suspect, when Stalin dies. And he publishes his second big work, which is called Жестокость, Cruelty. And that is about young people in the 1920s who are involved in criminality and policing, so clearly based on his own life. Now, this particular story he writes either in the very late 1940s or in the early 1950s. And if you would like, we can do a little potted summary of the plot, but maybe one of you would like to do it because it's such a curious little story. I'm interested to know what your take is on it.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna try to do it justice. We're gonna try not to I'm not gonna do a classic Cameron and spend like nearly half the length of an episode summarizing a work. For some reason, no matter like the shorter the work, the more granular I get, and the longer I take. I'm gonna try to avoid doing that. So we open the Polykhaevs with grandmother basically waiting out by the highway for her grandson. It's noted that she's been out there for the last couple of days, and she and the grandfather have been waiting for their grandson to return by the highway. And it seems like he's not going to come that day. He's already late, and they're really not certain until kind of late in the day after they've already given up. Their grandson, or rather kind of a stranger, arrives, and they realize as he gets closer that this is their grandson, Petya Petenka. And to the delight of his grandmother, and a little bit to the consternation of his grandfather, as Petenka isn't wearing either a proper hat and boots, and his grandfather's kind of like, did you drink your hat away? And I think Petenka's supposed to be in his late teens, so...
16.
16. Okay, yeah.
I calculated it using the dates backwards. Yeah, so he's very young.
Quite, yeah, a little bit young to have drunk away his hat at any rate. I mean, not that there's a good age for that. So they to delight of the grandparents, they bring their grandson inside, and they sit him down with two of their boarders, Veria and Galia, who are two surveyors working in the area. They begin talking. The grandfather, Yerofey Kuzmich, kind of is reflecting as they begin to talk that he really doesn't know who his grandson is. And they discuss why he's late. The grandson is learning to work with cement, which really pleases his grandfather, who is a bricklayer, as I understand it, and is really pleased with kind of the direction he's going. And the grandson seems very humble, and even though he doesn't really know him, he is getting roughly a good impression of him. As they're sitting there and having a couple drinks and a few things to eat, the grandmother, Nadia, begins to reminisce about the siege of Stalingrad, which is when they'd all been separated. Yerofey, her husband, tries to stop her, but Petya kind of says, no, actually, I would like you to continue. I don't know that much about this era. And so then she goes on to reflect more on that time, in which both of their sons had died during the siege of Stalingrad, as well as Petya's mother also disappearing along with their husbands, which left the two of them to take care of Petya. And then after a long time, and things are getting really bad in Stalingrad, and the grandmother Nadia finally convinces Yerofey to evacuate Petya. So they bring him to a boat, which is already quite an adventure, as the city is already war torn. They're worried about planes. On the way there, they encounter an escaped elephant, which Petya is quite enamored with. And then this whole adventure leads to them getting Petya to the boat, which then promptly is attacked by German planes and capsizes. The grandparents, obviously devastated, go back home, believing their grandson now to be dead, to find that while they were gone, their home had been bombed, had been destroyed, thus forcing them to a shelter, which they live out most of the rest of the siege in, until finally, Yerofey decides, we can't just keep doing this, and let's build a home. I'm a bricklayer. It's kind of ridiculous that we're just waiting here. And as they're building this home, which are actually surprisingly they're able to get the permits and materials for quite easily, they find out from a friend of theirs that their grandson's actually alive and going to school far east. And after a while, they write him, and a year later, finally he gets back in contact, and through his training coming back to Stalingrad, he's able to meet with his parents again, which the story's kind of wrapping up on a nice note until kind of inadvertently, one of the surveyors, I think Vera, reveals that the Volga is going to be widened, which means that the grandparents' house, the last major thing they maybe will be doing with their lives, is going to be destroyed soon, which they all tried to hide from the grandmother before she kind of reveals that she is not as dull as everyone seems to think she is, and kind of goes off on them for trying to protect her from, the life she's living, which is more or less where it ends off, as the grandfather says, let's kind of get off this topic. Let's go visit, I think it's the dam that he wanted to show Petya earlier in the story. So it's a pretty brief piece, but really a lot of really interesting interactions happening here in a really short period of time.
There's an awful lot poured into this story, isn't there? There's so much plot. It is 7,000, 8,000 words long, so you can read the entire thing in half an hour if you want. And the language isn't complicated. It's designed to be accessible to teens and to people who are pretty much barely literate or learning to read. But there's a lot of humanity in it as well, isn't there?
Yeah.
The part, it's not what you would expect. Me having told you that Nilin in the 30s was cranking out these really dull, prototypical socialist realist works. There are parts of it that are really quite touching. The way that the grandmother is characterized in the beginning of the story, hovering around and just sort of shuffling around the house and going out into the street and looking and waiting for Petya, please come back. And the story of how the grandfather is almost killed in Stalingrad, he's shot and miraculously survives. There's a whole sort of mythical symbolism around the resurrection of the city that we can get into if you're interested. But this is why this story is so interesting to me, is that it shows that socialist realism has this capacity for humanity and for people in a way that people just, by people I mean sort of Western readers, really just don't anticipate about this genre. They don't anticipate, especially a work written in 1950, 1951, the height of Stalinism, and certainly Stalingrad stories that were written at the time. many of them, there were a lot of these sort of reconstruction stories about the rebuilding of the city, but many of them were about, Stalin is God and gave us this glorious victory at Stalingrad. He laid the people down, sacrificed millions of them, thus was born new life. It's this sort of weird quasi-religious stuff. But this story is very, very ordinary, very human.
Yeah, I think that I like in the simplicity, there's something much more complex, kind of, that almost masks, the simplicity of it kind of masks something more complex going on, I think, in that when I read Cement for the first time, probably like a couple of years ago, I was amazed at kind of the psychological character that it was able to retain. And I still kind of felt like this it's like almost a Skaz sort of style. It's just very much like, I don't know, it felt just very personal and still even relatable, weirdly, in some parts. I mean, you kind of felt like you were sitting down at this table with everybody observing this conversation happening. I thought it was fascinating.
I think there are two layers to the personality in the story here. The first is historical, and that is to do with the fate of Nilin's mother, who I believe was killed during the war. I'll talk more about in a second. And the second is to do with the language itself. And I think Nilin has this really good command. I know, like many socialist realist authors, he wasn't just sitting in an office in Moscow imagining how people spoke. He was going out to the people and observing. He was going to these construction sites, taking notes. And interestingly, in that very long correspondence with his brother, he has his brother send him almost scripts, almost dialogues of things he's heard around the village, related somewhat as gossip and somewhat as, hey, Pavel, here's some stuff you can stick into your next story. You put it in verbatim. And I wonder, we don't have notes for this particular story. I wonder how much of this story is based on real stuff. So it's interesting that you mentioned this idea of Skaz, because I think there is almost an element of that, right, in the straightforwardness of the language. It's not as tricksy as Skaz. It's not as sort of cyclical. There's none of these arabesques that Gogol likes to lead us down. I think this issue of his mother is particularly interesting as well, because if we're talking about personality and personal feelings in the story, many people have made note that Vasily Grossman in Life and Fate and Stalingrad writes about his mother, who was Jewish and was killed in the Holocaust in Berdichev, and Grossman was always, he had a deep sense of guilt that he didn't use his power, he didn't use the position more to save his mother, or to attempt to save his mother. Whether he could have done or not is a different question. You have to read between the lines a little bit, but I wonder to what extent the grandmother character in this story is a bit of Nilin's own mother. And I know there are many literary critics who hate this kind of biographical reading of texts, but I think it's really inescapable here. And at some point in the narrative, you may not have noticed, but I noticed this when I was picking over it, rereading it before this podcast. Nilin slips from this third-person narrator into this, you wouldn't imagine the things we saw, you wouldn't imagine the things that we lived through back then. That it's not the grandmother or the grandfather talking, it's actually him talking, right? It's him addressing you, the reader, directly.
It's really, you're right, I did notice that, because I have to say the characters in talking about how he's getting these snippets from his brother, that kind of mind, that those things he's paying attention to makes sense, because in the way that you're reading the characters, just simply in the way they're characterized, especially what really drew me in was that dynamic between the grandmother and the grandfather. It's not just like these are two people, existing, telling a story with their grandson. You get a sense that this is, that they have an interaction, they have a dynamic, they've got a life lived together where they're kind of will get on each other, or they'll be sweet to each other, or they'll cut each other off and say, no, you're not telling the story the right way, or he doesn't want to hear this, and like it's a dynamic that you see in some people, and it feels very real in a way that either you have to be someone who's like just great at bringing together characters, or who's got an eye for watching how relationships form and how people act around each other. It's really just fascinating to see him put better character development than I see in frankly most work most works in general, and like creating such a sense of reality and character in like you said, like this very short piece of work.
Yeah, and I think that the characterization of the grandmother and the grandfather is really quite delightful, isn't it? It's really quite charming. This little relationship where they nag at each other and scold each other, and yeah, they really love each other, and they've been through so much, and they do have that up and down kind of dynamic. You're right. I think the characterization of the others is a little bit flimsy. Pietro especially seems like a very empty vessel, and in that this is a much more typical piece of socialist realism, right? That this 16-year-old boy has nothing to offer and very little to say, except the choice between being the sort of fancy dandy who would wear the wrong sort of boots and drink his cap away, or between, like his wonderful grandfather, going into the bricklaying trade. Right, that's it. He's one of two things, and we know exactly what he stands in for. The characters of the surveyors as well, I think, are quite roughly drawn out, shall we say. Sexistly drawn out as well. They exist to tempt Pietro and to be stupid and young and not understand that the grandparents' house that they've built has to be destroyed because that's progress. They're not just widening the Volga for the sake of it. They're widening the Volga to build the hydroelectric station so that they can dam another bit of the river, and by building the hydroelectric station, they bring light to the city. And what does bringing light mean? Well, there's the great religious message of the story, right? That Stalingrad has died and been resurrected. Now look at this wonderful construction project we can do. And I believe it was the largest hydroelectric power station in the world when it was finally built. There's a fact you don't hear every day.
I think this was something I liked about the story. I know it's typical of socialist realism, but I was listening to something else recently about just kind of writing in general, and in a mistake sometimes writers or people will do, which is taking something where the stakes feel real and trying to amplify them to be bigger than they are, maybe for the sake of that being more impactful. When that's not always the case in this, it's kind of small stakes compared to the general Soviet Union, the destruction of one house. But when you get that kind of microcosm of the progress of a whole life and everything it's created being destroyed, and willingly allowing that for the sake of progress, you get just this very, I guess, generally in the grand scheme of things, small stakes, but through the eyes of these Stalingrad survivors, really interesting statement on progress and sacrifice. And kind of sucks for them because the brick building that they were building for the orphans, back in the day, the government didn't want anything to do with, and now they want the house.
I know, it is a bit cheeky, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's I suppose the idea is that you're asking for more and more sacrifices, and the great movement in Stalingrad at the time, and really as soon as the battle ended, was this sort of opening the battle on the construction front. So as soon as the fighting has really ended, off they go and they clear the corpses from the city. They mention this in the story, and they gloss over that, but that was a grim job indeed. I think the statistic I read was something like 10 to 20,000 corpses were cleared in the month after the battle ended in Stalingrad. So that, deeply, deeply unpleasant work for these people that would have been starving and dying in the city. And then they sacrifice more and more. They sacrifice their living conditions, and they build the building, and then they sacrifice that building to give it to the orphanage. Then they build another building, and they sacrifice that. And yet they feel the whole time, and this is really what socialist realism is about, that we're always constructing something that's better. There is a real sense of utopianism, and people did come flooding to Stalingrad. People wanted to come to Stalingrad after the battle had finished to join in this sort of construction battle. Many thousands of people really did feel and really did request permission to go to Stalingrad so they could help there. which makes it seem like this house building is low stakes. But you're right, it is microcosmic of something much bigger, and the sacrifice that happened in the war makes the stakes of that 1930s coal production target story seem like nothing, right?
In a way, yeah, that's what I find. For me, the more I am researching and doing work around socialist realism, I find it really interesting that, yeah, that's exactly what I would have thought. And I think maybe that's the perception and reason that people don't like it, is because you think you're going to have some big communist triumph at the end of it, when really it reminds me even of maybe Platonov in some instances. What really communism is, it's a small, well, not small, but it's a personal sacrifice. It's done at a smaller level. It's not you yourself triumphing through, the land to establish communism. It's what you can do kind of in your community, almost at home. And I think that's like such an interesting thing to be pushing at the same time on a mass scale. The smallness, but on a mass scale, is what I find fascinating.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's almost an unfair comparison with Platonov, because Platonov's really good, and Nilin's just like, Pasha, good job, you made it out of Irkutsk. You're writing some stories now, and so proud of you. But there is something in here that's deeply profound, and I think if we were to pick characters who are deeply profound and tell us something about that sense of time and progress, then the experiences of the grandmother are clearly the most important in the story. There are just some beautiful moments in the story, and the way the narrative is constructed, where it almost reminds me of the Bronze Horseman. Again, not nearly as good, but these pendants swinging between creation and destruction and grief and happiness and the past and the future. And at times, in terms of the past and future, the grandmother has these experiences where you'd almost call them flashbacks, but they're not really flagged up as flashbacks. They sort of come upon you so fast that you don't realise that suddenly she's thinking back to the past and quite viscerally re-experiencing. And, we hear that she cries and almost breaks down in the present, but she's re-experiencing that trip through Stalingrad in August 1942 when the city is on fire, right? And she's just trying to get her little grandson out of the city and save him. And we hear that, her dress is burning, and she's running through the city. And if you want a sense of what that day was like, 40,000 people died on that day in Stalingrad. So this is, again, one small experience, but many people reading this story would have looked at that and thought, yep, this says something to me. This says something about what it was like during the war and what we can do now to make sense of all of that. And so the grandmother's swinging back and forth between the past and the present and trauma and... what is the opposite of trauma? Harmony, perhaps? But these sort of disjunct memories and this sense of a harmonised future or a harmonised present, that's really, I think, what we're supposed to experience in the story, and it's what I get from the story. This sense of jarringness, constantly striving for resolution, and we realise that the grandmother has found it, right? That little moment where they're all sort of quietly whispering away at the end of the story without the grandmother saying, oh, don't... nobody tell Granny the house is going to be destroyed. She's not going to like that. She won't be able to cope. And then she's like, listen up, kids. I know exactly what's what. I built this house with my bare two hands. Nothing's going to shock me. Her life is purposeful. Yeah,
that was definitely my experience. The construction of the story. We had to go back and reread several times because I would be reading and then I'd be like, wait a minute, what year are we in? Like, it would catch me off guard sometimes. I'd be like, wait a minute, he couldn't have just died. That wouldn't make sense. And I was like, oh, this is a flashback, right? But yeah, it's interesting that they're not all flagged like that. And I think that makes from a construction point of view, it's interesting. It's psychological. It, like I said, caught me off guard several times as I was going. I don't know about you, Cameron, but for me, it did.
No, yeah, it definitely did. And well, it did kind of draw me in because it is very much like, again, I know I'm kind of already hammering on this point of like how it does have a deep sense of realism to me. It's like talking to an old elderly relative about like a World War II wartime experience, and the way that it is kind of fluid, because it's, I mean, obviously for these two, it's only been a handful of years, less than a decade, but it is kind of similar to that, like that experience. And it like, that is, again, I'm still really hammering on this point, but the way in which Nilin is able to take this very personal, very individual story and make it almost not exactly universalized, but in talking about larger events through one single life, it captures it so much better than you could by trying to capture every single thing. Like, the basic story here is two grandparents who who evacuated their grandson, and a couple of years later he comes back home, and they talk about what happened in between. That's, for this era, I'm sure not at all an uncommon story. Maybe mutatis mutandis, it's the parents, it's, you know, a daughter, it's a cousin, it's whatever. But like, the basic idea is very familiar, and then they're just they're really realizing this is now a stranger, and they're trying to catch each other up, and they talk about their wartime experiences and their personal struggles. I mean, they didn't wait for someone to go give them a new house. They say, no, let's not wait for the council to give us a house. We're just going to build one. And the councils, when they tell them that, just say, okay, we don't really care. Here's some materials, I guess. And even when they try to give them their house, like, they're like, we have bigger things. We don't want your tiny little house. We could get more actual money to do these things. And in telling this tale and having it like, in many ways, this is pretty traditional for the conventions of socialist realism, but the strong, at least to me, this emphasis on like the individual and their particular lives and their agency is not what I was expecting. But in doing so, and in taking this like relatively unique story, it does make it feel universalized in a way that, like you've said, anyone reading this can say, yeah, this like roughly feels these emotions, even if it's not exactly what I felt. These rough emotions they're going through of loss, of need to do something, of like duty, of whatever, is something I can relate to, which is, even having not obviously not lived through Stalingrad, it's a set of tangible emotions I can grasp onto and try to understand that era or that mentality. And you really do get like a sense of the type of people who came out of this experience and how it changed them.
I don't know if it's fair to do this every time I can do it, but I'll just say it. When I was reading it, it really had the same strand of like Tolstoyan, like Svetlana Alexievich, like that kind of granular. Get the editor, come on. Granular like approach to historical retelling, almost kind of that this one single experience can tell you something that looking at an event kind of large scale perhaps would not be able to reveal to you. I'm sure there's other influences besides those two, but those were the ones that came to my mind as I was reading both forwards and backwards, I guess, to do that.
Oh boy, are there ever other influences? Do you want to hear about some of the influences?
Yes, I would love to.
One of the things that I think is interesting about socialist realism is that it's specifically a genre constructed around imitation. Right? This is not born out of the romantic idea of the writer as this sort of inspired creator coming up with something completely unique. You can just patchwork your story together out of stuff you've seen elsewhere. And so part of it is, going out to the people, going out to the construction sites, going to Stalingrad and interviewing people, observing them in action, asking your brother, hey bro, can you send me some hot gossip from the milk farm? But also part of it, especially when it comes to Stalingrad, is looking for models of texts. And Nilin draws really heavily on Konstantin Simonov's novel Days and Nights, which came out in 1943. That's the big Stalingrad novel at this point. Grossman's Stalingrad for a Just Cause wouldn't be released till 1952. And especially the images of the fighting around the houses, especially the image of the Volga, the importance of the river. And there is a beautiful scene where the grandfather goes and pulls off his cap and sticks it into the Volga and feeds water to the grandmother when she's, almost dying from this evacuation. That's borrowed pretty much note for note from a story by Simonov where the protagonist, who is an officer, does that. And in turn, Simonov actually draws on a medieval tale. I can't remember whether it's the Lay of Igor's Campaign or Zadonshchina, so nobody check which one it is, where the lead character, in whichever one it is, drinks, symbolically pulls their helmet off and drinks from the Volga's water, or maybe from the Don's water, and it's this sort of great life-giving water. So there's a lot going on there that people would recognise. There's definitely a Tolstoyan influence, Matt. I think you're absolutely right.
There always has to be.
I mean, especially when it comes to war literature as well. And war literature, all of war literature, but all of Russian war literature in particular, you can't escape Tolstoy. He's just there looming in the background. In here, I think the grandmother's experience of what it's like to go through the city is the most Tolstoyan aspect, where she's just confused by battle. She has no idea what's happening. She can't make sense of it. Things are flying at her. Bombs are exploding. There's an elephant for some reason that I don't understand, but it did happen. She just sort of acts on instinct, and that's the Tolstoyan model of the soldier. So the grandmother almost briefly becomes a soldier, right? She doesn't fight with bullets. She doesn't pick up a rifle, but she has that experience of the battlefield. So there's all this stuff going on that Nilin draws on, and all of that is designed to signal to the reader what they're supposed to be feeling, and it gives a framework for these traumatic memories, these flashbacks and flash forwards that wrench us back and forth along with the grandmother. Right? It gives us something to cling on to. When you see the drinking of the water of the Volga, okay, I get that. I know what we're supposed to be doing. It's almost like, the fairy tales, Vladimir Prop, where, okay, I get it. This is what this is supposed to do. This is what this part is supposed to do. And I mentioned the resurrection of Stalingrad, right? When the grandmother or the grandfather dies, that's actually another part that's taken from Simonov's Days and Nights, where, again, it's the protagonist, the officer who is shot, nearly dies, and his heart starts beating again. His love interest is holding his chest, and his heart starts beating again as the guns fire up for the great counterattack that wins the battle, which I've rendered it in a way that makes it seem really crappy, but it's not. It's actually a beautiful piece of writing. And here, the grandfather dies and is nursed back to health, and lo and behold, as he is nursed back to health, the city finds itself nursed back to health. So the fate of the nation is duly embodied in both Stalingrad and the individual. All of this stuff then couches these microcosmic experiences, something big, something that is very meaningful. So when we read about these seemingly bizarre construction projects that have nothing to do with anyone and seem very impersonal, they also relate to a much bigger literature and a much bigger sort of cultural push around reconstruction.
I didn't want to take it too off the rails, but we very rarely have the translator of a work come to talk about the work they have translated. So I was wondering, as translator of this work, if there were any interesting features or approaches that you would take to something like this. I know a lot of our listeners are interested in the process of translation, myself included too. So I would just be curious to hear kind of how was it?
I think actually the difficulty in a text like this is twofold. Firstly, getting those the segues, getting those right was quite hard, because Russian tenses are in some ways more subtle than English tenses. Because of the imperfective and perfective aspects. You can be a bit cleverer and a bit more multifaceted in the way that you use those verbs, whereas English is like, here is a menu of 16 items, which do you want? They all mean exactly one thing. And so finding ways to slide from the one time into the other time is quite hard. The other thing that, of course, is hard in a text like this is finding the right voice for the characters. And so I've rendered it as is my wont in this sort of conversational, Britishy kind of English. Almost wartime English, almost, how's your father, Cockney character for the grandfather, because I think that fits him. But this is the part where you have to, as the translator, allow your imagination to run riot a little bit. That the translation is an act of creativity in and of itself, and that you can't capture the language of 1950s or late 1940s Stalingrad that has all these Sovietisms and get it right. So, for example, there is a phrase in the text that I translated as, "We formed our own little Stalingrad construction co." Right, which is, and of course, there were no anything construction co's in the Soviet Union because everything was state-owned. And nobody would have talked like that. But the alternative, I can't remember what the Russian was because it was quite a while ago that I translated it, but the alternative in Russian was one of those really sort of heavy administrative sort of Soviet titles, and I just felt that translating it in a more literal way wouldn't quite capture the kind of jaunty and chatty way that the Babushka and Delushka interact with each other. So it was a guess. And maybe someone would read that Russian and read my English and say, "That's a bloody horrible decision. What were you thinking?" But I stand by it.
I would too. I think we had that when we were doing Solzhenitsyn's Matryona's House, and Cameron was reading one translation, I was reading mine, and mine was significantly funnier and a little bit more satirical in some of the parts, and Cameron had the administrative words, and he was like, "I don't understand what's happening." But I think that's good. I think it's definitely hard to kind of strike that balance between authenticity to the text, but also, readability. I don't want to have to go look up, these old 50s administrative terms, like every line, to make sure that I've got, the right one as I'm going through. But, I liked it for what it's worth.
Great. I'll take that in my poll of one people.
Yeah, it's extremely readable. It's going through. Sometimes you kind of get caught up and remember, I'm reading a translation, but it didn't really have that feel. I feel like I'm just bandwagoning with Matt now, but I just did want to say that it was just really an enjoyable read to go through. It felt very natural. So I think your style, your goal in trying to achieve that is really successful, in the sense that I didn't even notice it until you brought it up. It felt so natural to me when I was going through.
Perfect. As somebody who is proofreading a book that includes 60,000 words worth of translations right now, this is music to my ears.
Can you talk a little bit about your book and what it is, how you got to it? I'm curious because it sounds really interesting. Okay,
so the book is a compilation of compilations. It's not that. You can edit that bit out. So the book is a compilation of two things. On the one hand, historical commentary, and I suppose cultural commentary as well, and on the other hand, translations of stories. And these are stories that were written for the Soviet Central Papers at the Stalingrad Front in 1942, 1943, and then two more stories, one from a decade afterwards and one from 2 decades afterwards. And what's super, super cool about these stories is that the Soviets didn't just send journalists to the front to write newspaper stories, they sent fiction writers, which is totally in line with everything we've heard about socialist realism and trying to make the vastness of this, the scale of this war and the trauma of this war make sense. And so what we find in Stalingrad living together and working together are Vasily Grossman, one of the great literary geniuses of the 20th century, if not the great literary genius. Nobody write me anything about that. Again, I stand by it. I said it. I meant it. We find Konstantin Simonov is there, who is hugely underrated in the West, but a brilliant, brilliant prose author. We find Ilya Ehrenburg is not there for very long because he's quite old, but he does visit very briefly. We find Boris Polykhaevs, who is a huge socialist realist author. We find another 12, 15 authors who are all there. And they aren't just sitting behind the lines, 10 miles behind the lines, sort of seeing what's going on. They go off to the front. They're in Stalingrad, just like Babushka in this story, seeing the fire, seeing the flames, experiencing it for themselves and writing up these works of fiction. And basically they create this whole myth of Stalingrad as this great sacrifice and resurrection. They make the whole war make sense for the nation and for Stalin as well, because Stalin nips in at the end and claims all the credit for himself, cheeky bastard that he is. And yet nobody's ever looked at these stories before. Really. So this came out of my PhD dissertation, where I looked at a much broader swathe of Stalingrad in Soviet literature. And I thought, people need to read these stories, because they are genuinely great. This Pavel Nilin story is interesting, right? But some of these stories are genuinely great pieces of literature. And so you can read in the book month by month, the stories that are written as we hear about this horrible bombing raid in August, as we hear about hope ebbing away and then this glorious and very unexpected counterattack, things getting better, and then we fast forward 10 years ahead to see some of this reconstruction in action from somebody that's there, and then 20 years ahead to hear of a veteran who was at the front and can't make sense of all of this. And that's Viktor Nekrasov, who's, I think, the other very, very great Soviet Stalingrad author. I think he stands, in terms of Stalingrad work, stands side by side with Grossman in terms of greatness, and in the story that closes the work, which is, it's a really magnificent piece of writing. It's stunningly good. And if you think this one is weird and personal and plays with time for a socialist realist work, wait till you see this Nekrasov story. You're going to lose your minds.
I can't wait.
I'm excited. You're deepest appraised of when that's coming out, because I'm just jazzed. This is stuff I love. I love.
Oh, prepare
era of
for
history,
an onslaught of shameless self promotion when it's ready.
I'm happy. I would love to have it. I was going through your blog today. It's all been super fascinating. It was actually right before we jumped on, was entranced by an article on sci-fi mythologization of Stalingrad and modern Russia. I'll link the blog in the show notes. It's really cool. I've been enjoying everything so far.
I know I had to pull Cameron away because the original book that you had suggested was pretty long, and he was like, I think I'll just read it anyways. And I was like, we gotta crank the shows out though. But he's like, but we're gonna return to it, and I was like, we can return to it.
Well, if you wanna talk about Nekrasov and In the Trenches of Stalingrad at some point, that is a majestic work. It's a brilliant piece of writing.
I would. Yeah.
But it is longer. Yeah. It's not Grossman long. Nobody panic who's listening. It's only 200 pages long. You can read it in an afternoon.
A nice, reasonable long. Or, we could do all of Life and Fate in one episode. I'm sure 1 hour is enough to cover everything in that book.
If you're going to do it, you've got to do the Stalingrad novel first. You've got to do both Stalingrad and Life and Fate.
I gotta do it. We've got to create a whole pathway here for the proper introduction of each of these works. You start from influence to outcome.
Or you could do it kind of like the Star Wars, how they have what is it, the order is the separate order, so you can read them all, so you save the main twist till the end. You could do one of those maybe.
I haven't previously thought of using Star Wars as a guide for planning out content here, but
no,
good point, Matt. Thank you.
Did you have any other things to cover?
I'll defer to Ian on this one. You think is there any major last points of the story you thought would be good to bring up?
I think we've bled the story for what it's worth.
That's what we're here for.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
A great evening. All right. Perfect. Well, Matt, what, as sad as I am to leave this episode, what are we reading next episode?
Next episode, we're going to be starting our next long series, which is going to be on Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. For part 1, we're going to be joined by Dr. Catherine Bowers, who is, among many other things, a professor at the University of British Columbia and the vice president of the North American Dostoevsky Society. We'll be covering it one part per episode and have a lot of really interesting guests lined up. If you're planning on reading along with us, be sure to pick up your copy through our affiliate links on our website. We also, very excitingly, now have links for audiobooks, so go ahead and check those out if you want to support your local bookstore while you listen along. We earn a little bit of money from qualifying purchases, and it is much appreciated.
Yes, and you don't want to not read Crime and Punishment as we're going along, because although we're going to be discussing quite a bit, there is so much that you can really only experience by reading it yourself. So we'd highly encourage that you do.
Do it. Right now. Read it. Live it. Love it. Live the crime. Love the punishment. It's Dostoevsky.
If you commit any axe murders, make sure to wear our axe shirt.
Oh yeah, we got merch now. That's crazy. We got so much stuff. We'll talk about it next episode. It's going to be great. Before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current patrons. Drew, Jeff, Janice, Ann, Jesse, Madeline, Alex, Daniel, Irini, Paige, Darren, Larkin, Lou, Brandon, Allison, Gary, Cole, Daniel, Jack, Lucy, Alex, Roland, Elise, Mysterious Donor Dude, Joanne, and Drew W. Podcasting isn't free and grad school doesn't pay very well, so if you're interested in joining with our current patrons to keep the show running, take a look at our Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy.
The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow our Instagram at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast or join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
You'll hear from us again soon.